Hey, it's Matthew Cudmore with Story Behind the Stone, where we talk story, sacrifice, and service, connecting you with the past and the most interesting people working in the fields of history, veterans commemoration, and veterans causes. The other day, Ryan and I sat down with Sam Edwards, a historian, writer, and runner. He's the running historian. He's author of Allies in Memory. It's the 10th anniversary of his novel, so we are so excited to catch up with him. In today's episode, we talked about the Allies, we talked about Normandy, we talked about Masters of the Air for any Apple TV Plus fans. He's currently a professor at Loughborough University in the UK. We're so thrilled to have this conversation with him. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in, as always. And Sam, thank you for a great conversation. Lots to look forward to.
Welcome to the show where we talk service, sacrifice, and stories, connecting you to the past and the most interesting people in the field of veteran causes and commemorations. My name is Ryan, along with co-host Matt, and we're with Memory Anchor, a company committed to using technology for good as we change the way the world remembers. So today we are talking with Professor Sam Edwards with Loughborough University. Sam, thank you so much for being with us and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to talking with you.
Sam, it's great to see you. We've had a chat just now just around all of the amazing things that you are working on, well, last year, this year, and into 2026. It is hard to keep up with all of your work. It spans such a breadth, but I would love to just get into kind of how you got started in this area of memory, commemoration, and history.
So I guess ultimately it goes back to when I was a kid or when I was a teenager, sort of 13, 14, because I grew up in a part of England, Eastern England, and Suffolk in particular, which during World War II had been occupied by the American military, by the US 8th Air Force. And by the time sort of summer of 1944-45, there's like 500,000 Americans just in that little bit of England. Masses of air crew, airplanes, airfields as well. 50 years later, I'm growing up in the 1990s and became increasingly aware of it, partly because I was getting really fascinated with history, just full stop, but also because every summer in the mid-90s would see groups of American veterans come back and they'd visit their old bases and dedicate memorials. And it just got me really interested, really fascinated, thinking about that past, which was just around and near where I was growing up. So yeah, I guess ultimately it goes back there.
But that is actually an astonishing number. So 500,000 Americans. We've all seen. Well, I hope a lot of our listeners have seen Masters of the Air. One of the most interesting parts of it, I think, was seeing kind of the base culture and everything. What did they get right in the show?
So I really liked it. I thought there's a lot that they got right. I thought how they depicted the kind of the chaos and the carnage of air combat was really impressive. It kind of really brought home the sheer terror of fighting up there in the frozen skies of Europe. So I thought they did that really well. I thought they had a really good take on just the bases as well. They painstaking attention to detail. So they physically recreated, not in Eastern England but somewhere else in England, the base that the 100th Bomb Group flew out of, which was in Thorpe Abbotts in South Norfolk. So they physically kind of recreated all the key architecture and the control tower and some of the Nissen huts and all that kind of stuff, and really close attention to detail. And I think they did that well. And I think they also did well that sense that these were places which got a lot of attention, a lot of interest from local people as well. There's some fantastic scenes in the early episodes of kids wandering onto the base to talk to the ground crew. Absolutely happened. So I think there's lots that they got right there.
Your answer got me thinking about kind of Anglo-American relations and what did it mean for the local, population that there was such a massive. Well, you called it an occupation.
Yes, it's one of the ways it's often described by historians is an occupation, or it's the friendly invasion, right? This sense of it's an invasion, it's an occupation, and I think it fair to say that for Eastern England, which is kind of quiet and rural and agricultural, it's the arrival of the Americans between 42 and 44 is the kind of the most profound change to the place, to the landscape, to kind of the lives of local people for about half a millennia. You'd have to go back to kind of like the dissolution of the monasteries or kind of Puritan migration in the early modern era for something comparable. That's kind of how big it was, I think.
Yeah, completely disruptive, like overnight, probably, that kind of experience.
Yeah, you think that you got these little villages, these tiny hamlets, and almost overnight, 3,000 Americans arrive. often, and therefore outnumbering the villagers, by 2 to 1, 3 to 1, sometimes more.
You published a book 10 years ago, Allies in Memory. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about that book and what led you to get into that place of publishing?
So, to pick up my story from where I was a little while ago, so 1990s, picture the scene, me and my best mate, we're cycling around at the weekends, we're cycling around the old American bases. We're kind of, exploring the ruined control towers and the Nissen huts and all that kind of stuff. And then a few years later, I go off to university to study history because I'm really interested in history. And then it gets to that, what for me was the best bit of doing an undergraduate degree in history, which is you get to write a dissertation. That is, you get to do your own bit of historical research and then write 10,000 words about it. So I plumbed for the thing that really interested me, which was the 8th Air Force and its impact on Eastern England. But as I was sort of talking about that with my professor, it kind of got around to, why don't you focus on especially the memory and commemoration of the 8th Air Force? And so I sort of wrote my undergrad dissertation on that. And I got to the end of that after about 6 months of doing that. And I thought, I've not finished this. There's more to say. So then I went back for a master's and did a little bit more of it. And then I went back for a PhD and did a little bit more of it. And then the book came out of all of that. So on one level, Allies in Memory, that book started probably somewhere around about 1994.
This idea of memory, you speak of it and you've done so much work about it. And I'm sure the nuances of memory is much more than what I'm just thinking of here right now. So what does memory mean, and especially in the context of conflict?
So I've been looking at memory at its kind of collective, at its kind of social and cultural dynamic. And so to study that, to think about that, I've often been interested in thinking about what are the spaces and places and locations that people gather at and around in order to very consciously, very deliberately remember. And so that means I spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about monuments and memorials and thinking about who makes these things, who creates them, what are they trying to achieve, what do they say, both in the words that they use and also in the design, in the imagery, in the iconography. So that's the way I've been mainly thinking about memory in my studies, especially in my writing over the last 15 years or so now. It's that kind of cultural, collective, social dynamic, and monuments and memorials as the spaces which give us just a little window on what happens when people get together in order to commemorate, in order to remember.
As you're saying that, we've done a lot of work with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I've just been doing some geomapping of the Tynecott Cemetery.
Oh, wow.
And it's really interesting how, you look at this cemetery, for example, and as you're talking about memory, I went there in 2017 and really didn't understand what I was looking at. And now that I've come back and mapped it, you're seeing this as part of like this Battle of Passchendaele. And there's actually in the cemetery pillboxes, and there's soldiers that were buried around this area. In the middle of the cemetery is this broken up hospital style graveyard, and then thousands and thousands of graves of just rows, and then 30,000 names. This monument really does share more than just the individual's names. There's a story, there's a context there. And it's interesting how you talk about memory and the use of architecture in these cemeteries. We see it in these cemeteries. Technology and stuff is also playing a role in memory too. What are your takes on how technology can play a role in commemoration of memory?
I think technology has a really powerful and useful role to play, because lots of the things we're talking about here, right, a 20th century conflict, it's World War I or it's World War II. The living connection with World War I is gone. The living connection with World War II is fading and disappearing, very sadly, all the time. So we're heading into a future now where that living link, that sense of we still walk the earth with people that lived that moment themselves, that's about to go, right? And so what do you do in that moment? Well, you need hopefully strategies, innovations, which will keep these things alive on some level. If we as communities and societies, individuals think that's important, and I do, then we need to figure out ways to take the memory into the future. And I think that's where technology has a really powerful role to play as a means to take those stories into the future, to keep the memory alive and vital.
There's so many different forms of technology. I look at some of the media that's been put out. We think of Band of Brothers or we think of Saving Private Ryan. There's some challenges with that too, isn't there?
There is, telling stories of World War II, which is what these things are, TV series, films. That's always a challenging thing. There are parameters. There's a line to walk. At least if it's going to be done well and in a way, hopefully, which is going to be well received, because you're dealing with events that that people have lots of emotional connections with, even if they haven't lived them themselves. These are events that family members you're involved in on some level. My grandparents were served in World War II, so there's a challenge there, right? There's a risk, I guess, for the storyteller, a challenge as well. But film, TV, these do offer a means, a mechanism to tell those stories, and as we were saying a moment ago, to kind of keep things alive and keep them vital and put them back before audiences.
Yeah, when we think of some of these media, they're so powerful. They capture the attention, and I think some of the ones that I just said, they're done quite well. And yet, what ends up happening is the whole experience then is now the 101st Airborne for some people.
And that is the risk of them again. Yeah, I guess that one risk is that they might reduce the narrative, reduce the story, and it becomes just this particular organization or unit, or at least they get all the attention, all the glory. We were talking about Masters of the Air, which I think is great. It is very focused on the 100th bomb group. There are many others, and hopefully what we hope comes out of it is that in drawing attention to one, it draws attention to more. But I get where you're coming from there. That there is that risk that maybe things get kind of reduced and overly simplified, and it's just it's the 101st at Bastogne, and those are the only folks that were there.
Yeah, and and how do we like, so when it comes to memory, how do we do it well?
So the phrase I like to use is complicated's good. That I think one of the ways in which you and I, us, can kind of keep memory alive and vital, and hopefully ensure that commemorations of 20th century conflict continue to have a presence and a profile, because I think they're really important, powerful vehicles to say, this is what happened and let's not do this again. One of the ways that we can do that is hopefully to endlessly try to complicate the stories and the narratives and draw out those voices and experiences which have been overlooked. And that's the challenge as well, because memory wants to simplify, it wants to kind of just reduce it down to something which can be taken away, I think, often, at least at cultural memory level. But I think the challenge is to try to complicated memory, I think, is a good way forward.
You posted the other day about, the 60th anniversary of Winston Churchill's funeral.
Yes, 60th anniversary of the funeral of Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
Which, in its moment, it was a huge televisual event. It's one of a couple of this era, at least in kind of British terms, the coronation of 53. But Winston Churchill's state funeral in 1965 is a huge televisual event. And it's a really interesting moment because he is such a kind of mythologized figure. He's also a figure who was himself an active mythologizer, in that he was a storyteller, he was an orator, he was a narrator, he was a brilliant writer. There was always a bit of myth making at work in terms of Churchill telling the story of his own life. The funeral then is this kind of fascinating moment where the beginning of the mythologization of Churchill in kind of his in his afterlife really starts to take off, and the ceremony is fascinating. It plays up some of the American connections because he's famously, his mum's American. He has American citizenship. It's given to him honorary citizenship by JFK. So one of the features of the ceremony of Churchill's funeral was the playing by a British Army band of the Star Spangled Banner, in order to kind of play up that transatlantic, that Anglo-American quality.
It's very interesting to see. I mean, I feel like we're living through history right now. I'm curious, how the modern day will be interpreted, and you also talked about historiography. But how do people talk about the funeral at the time?
So at the time, it gets widespread press coverage, media coverage, both sides of the Atlantic. There is understandably quite a lot of interest and attention in choreography of the occasion, because like any state occasion like this, coronation's another example, these are meticulously planned. There is a point and purpose to every feature, to every aspect, to the involvement of this person, these individuals, the procession, etc., etc. So there's a lot of interest in that at the time. Subsequently, of course, Churchill, there's a minor industry around scholarship on Churchill. I think, the American Civil War, epic industry around the scholarship on that. Winston Churchill, an enormous kind of industry around revisiting, rethinking, pondering, exploring, examining who he was, what his motivations were, what his significance was. And of course, in recent years, there have been some critical takes with regards to aspects of his reputation and aspects of things that he did and said at the time. So there's a fascinating, massive historiography out there on Churchill.
So Sam, given your work and your background and experience, like what's that purpose or that big picture goal that you want to leave imprinted on your students, on the world, on everyone in general?
So I guess that kind of the ultimate agenda, and this is only something I've been thinking about on a conscious level maybe for the last couple of years or so, is that having started out working on the commemoration of conflict, and especially I was interested in commemoration of 8th Air Force and D-Day and these kind of moments. In recent years, I've kind of taken my interest, still in the territory of memory and commemoration, but I've been especially interested in the role that memory and commemoration plays in diplomacy and in interstate relations, and really interested in the idea that that memory is used, it's instrumentalized, it's taken up, sometimes very deliberately, in order to cultivate connections between one society and another. Because if you can reach into history, use memory to reach into history and to say, we're together now and we've always been together, or we were previously together at this point or this point or this point, that's a really powerful diplomatic strategy. And so I've been really interested in memory, commemoration, and especially transatlantic relations, and how we were talking a moment ago about Churchill's funeral, the idea of that funeral. I'm not suggesting it was kind of cynically manipulated or anything like that, but it was a ceremony which enabled the British state to say something to the American allies, that this is our most famous statesperson, and they had important American connections.
We have those quotes that those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, or history doesn't repeat, it echoes.
Yeah.
And that aspect of memory, and I think, I've heard this many times from veterans, and anecdotally, I've heard it as they say this aspect of never again, but yet we seem to have amnesia as a society sometimes. But I think this is kind of going back to our conversation where technology can really help. This, when we give access, we can invoke emotion or connect people to story. And I think that story is so important. I think historically, we sat around fires and that's how we communicated lessons and things that were important, is through story. Is there a story that really sticks out for you that you've heard anecdotally or maybe in person from a veteran or someone?
So I guess the stories that really struck home for me when I began my sort of work in this field, this is 20 years or so ago now. But it is the stories of those veterans returning to their old air bases in the 1980s and 1990s, and the story of what these places meant to them. These were intense emotional experiences. The language used in kind of the press reports at the time, which would cover their returns, the local press in Eastern England, the language used was the language of pilgrimage. The idea that this wasn't just this wasn't tourism. This wasn't just a sort of an absent-minded return. We're in Europe. We'll make we'll pop over to the old base. This is very deliberate. It's very carefully planned, and it's deeply, deeply emotional. And it really came through for me when I was doing some research, and I found some sources in a local archive in Eastern England, and they were connected to one of the airfields in Norfolk. It was Hardwick, one of the airfields in South Norfolk, occupied by the Americans during the war. And in the 1990s, there's a potential plan by the local council to turn it into a refuse site, because it's kind of an abandoned landscape, right? To turn it into a refuse site. And once that emerges, once that news kind of gets out there, there's obviously frustration, complaint, bit of anger at the local level, but absolutely as well amongst the American veterans. And it really came home for me when I was reading some of this material, and one of the veterans writing in a letter to the county council saying, please don't do this. I'm going to try and get the words right here now, but said something along the lines of, it's not empty ground. This is sacred ground, watered with our tears. That's the phrase, and dedicated to our dead. And it was in that kind of encounter with that kind of source material that it really brought home for me the significance of these now kind of quiet agricultural fields in Eastern England, that they're sacred ground.
Even again, just mapping some of these sites like Tyncott is, I get focused on the cemetery, but I look to the right and there's, 4 or 5 houses that are directly attached to the cemetery, just residential houses, or you go over and you even see the Canadian monument, which is to this horrendous battle, watered with blood and tears.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a block there, and it's just a simple granite block, but it's something that I don't know how to even. It's in some way, as life moves on, that's a bit of an honor, but at the same time, it's like, what do we do with that land too? And I think that what a beautiful line is, this ground watered with our tears.
Right.
And so, when we take these memories of these individuals, I think one of the things that I have a lot of fear over is a loss of that emotion and such. And in your experience, what's the best way to keep that memory alive?
I think one of the really powerful ways to keep that memory alive is to do what we've been talking about, that we've done, which is to go to these places, to go to them, to visit them, to experience them. So I think on one hand, technology is a powerful tool for kind of animating and for the storytelling and for bringing out that kind of that human dynamic, that human kind of experience. But the other thing that we can and should do, if you have the means and ability, I think, to visit some of these spaces and places and to experience firsthand what you just described there, that sense of being in a place. We were talking a moment ago about history echoes, to be in a place where if you listen, you might just pick up the echoes.
Is there, and if it's a secret, you don't have to reveal it, is there a corner of Eastern England that is really special to you that you like to visit?
So probably the bit of the county that I most frequently visited with my best friend back in the day was Flixton Airfield, which is just at the borders of Norfolk and Suffolk. You can find it on Google Maps if you're interested. And the reason being, it was 20 miles from home, which is a good day's cycle, right? You can get there, you have your lunch, you wander around the airfield, you explore the ruined buildings. There's a little museum there. Visit the museum, and then you can still cycle back on a nice long summer's day. So that's probably the place where, if I had to tie all my interest down to geography on one level, I think that's probably where it's.
We'll put the proper spelling and pronunciation in the show notes, and your secret's been revealed. Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
It's always interesting to know what are those special places for people that kind of that pull up. There's a couple cemeteries for myself that have special meaning, like Grosbeak or Bennay-sur-Mer, which was my first Commonwealth War Graves cemetery to go into. And then there's just, each headstone has a story, has a narrative. Sam, are you open to some quick fire questions that we just shoot them out to you and that you just throw a quick answer back?
Go for it. Let's do it.
Okay. So we deal with, this is a biased question, but we deal with a lot of cemeteries. Is there a cemetery you've ever been to that really is close to your heart or has captured your attention?
For me, it's you probably guessed this. It's Madingley, right? Madingley outside Cambridge, the American Military Cemetery there. It's one of the first ones I became aware of, and I think it's a really powerful bit of landscape.
I love that. Okay, if you could go through time, have a coffee, a dinner with a historical figure, who would it be and why?
Oh, well, okay. You got me here. I'm going to have to chew for a second.
You have a dinner party then.
Who would I want to encounter from history? Let's keep it something that makes sense in the context of the conversation we've been having. Let's say Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart. Partly because I'm a big film fan, right? And some of his films, Smith Goes to Washington, fantastic. but partly because, obviously, he's an 8th Air Force veteran, right? And in about 1974, I want to say, I might get the date wrong here, 75, 76, he makes his own pilgrimage back to his old base in Norfolk. And there's some fantastically evocative imagery out there of him walking the old airfield. So let's say Jimmy Stewart.
If there's a couple books that you recommend or an author, what would you recommend when it comes to memory and military history?
So academic wise, I think one of the books that really got me thinking about this is by Jay Winter. This thing is about 1995, and it's Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, which I think was really influential for me because there'd been a lot of discussion before then about politics of memory, which I've worked on as well. But what Jay Winter does in that book is says, yes, the politics are there, but also these are places where people went to grieve and to cry, and that we should be attentive to that too. So Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning.
A little bit off-piste, but since we've been very Masters of the Air focused, is there an aircraft that you think deserves more attention out of all of them that were shielded?
I'm gonna wear my trustee of the 2nd Air Division Memorial Library here and say the B-24, right? The B-17 gets all the attention, all the press copy, all the TV series. B-24 is where it's at, though. That's the workhorse. That's the beast. So let's give that some attention as well.
Well, thanks for answering the quick fire questions, Sam. So looking forward for you in the future, what are some projects you have going, or some events that are coming that you're excited about or your eyes are going to?
So a couple of things that's on the horizon that I'm really excited about. One is later this year. So I mentioned an institution a minute ago, the 2nd Air Division Memorial Library. It's now called the American Library, but it's originally the 2nd Air Division Memorial Library. 2nd Air Division was a constituent of the 8th Air Force. And in 1963, a memorial library funded by the veterans was dedicated in the city of Norwich in eastern England. And this September, there in the city at the library, there's a whole bunch of commemorative events going on called Silver Wings, which is being organised by the people in the library there, and also in the local community. And I'm going to be a little bit involved in that, and really looking forward to that. So that'll be cool. And then next year is a biggie as a historian of US-UK relations. It's the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And another organisation I'm linked in with, which is Soulgrave Manor in Northamptonshire in England. It's the ancestral home of George Washington. Next year, we're going to do a bunch of stuff to tie in with that 250th anniversary. So it's going to be a busy couple of years.
I still can't believe how much you're involved with.
Sometimes.
Yeah, well, and it's great. And you're living your mission,
yeah.
And looking at, sharing that memory, using that memory, and then hopefully we can use that and informing how we engage with each other and into the future. Is there any question that we didn't ask you were hoping that we did ask?
I think you covered it, guys, because this has been really cool. Yeah, it's been really cool to just sort of talk about where this starts for me, because I don't think anyone's really asked it as you have. So I think we covered it. If you wanted, you could ask me where my interest in Normandy and the D-Day side of stuff began, and I can give you a story on that one. But other than that, I think you covered it.
Well, I would love to hear that. We were just out at the 80th. My wife and I managed to make it down there. We were using the app at the cemeteries. We had veterans actually using the app to find their friends, and it was a very emotional time, and being able to see that. So, what is your perspective, your involvement, and with the 80th and such?
So I was a little bit, but only very peripherally, involved in the 80th. I just become trustee of the D-Day story down in Portsmouth, but only just at the very end of last year. Everything already happened by that point, but they did some outstanding stuff, that museum and the good people of Portsmouth, in June 5th last year. So there's some really powerful stuff there. And Normandy is just such a fascinating place. Together with Eastern England, it's the place that I've spent a lot of time at and toured around. And if the interest in the memory of the 8th Air Force begins somewhere in the mid-1990s on a bike on an airfield, then my interest in the memory of D-Day and of Normandy likewise begins in the mid-1990s on a bike. I turned 16 in a campsite with my best mate just about 3 miles from Omaha Beach. And can you believe it? My folks let his folks as well, they let us bike around Normandy at the age of 15, 16. No mobile phones, nothing like that. But that's what we did because we wanted to see where that history happened.
That's amazing. And at such a young age to be captivated by that. What a different time we grew up in, being able to bike around Normandy. One last question is, from what you know of Normandy, like what's the message? What's the memory of Normandy that we should keep preserved?
I think it's, if you step back 2 paces and look at what happened there, it is the story of, it might sound a cliche, but it is the story of the assembled might of democracy gathering itself in order to defeat fascism and dictatorship. And it is in the detail of the history of that event, that landings. It is the story of a multinational operation of different communities and cultures and peoples coming together with a single objective and achieving it. And I think if there's a story for the 21st century, there's a good one.
One of the things that sticks in as you're thinking of that, I think of Eisenhower's letters to the soldiers as they're embarking, leaving Portsmouth, getting on their craft, and they have that letter with them and the eyes of the world on them. It's a powerful force when people come together, united in higher principle. Yeah,
absolutely. Agreed.
Well, Sam, listen, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and perspectives with us, your history, what makes you tick and what motivates you. It was really interesting to hear that. I'm going to be putting the Allies in Memory on my book list for sure. That being the 10th anniversary coming up for your book there. I've been just browsing through it as we talked in some of the topics there. So really excited to get that. But thank you so much again for your time. For the listeners, we'll make sure to update the show notes so you can click on and look up that information. Lastly, Sam, is there any place that if people want to know more or learn more about some of the work you're doing, where can they go?
So you can check out my website, which is www.runninghistorian.com. The other thing I do is a lot of running, so my tag there is Running Historian, and you can find me under that on Blue Sky as well.
Well, thanks again, Sam. For the listeners, please like and share the podcast, and we're looking forward to seeing you next time.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks.